Hi, I'm John Maddux. I'm from Greater Cincinnati. I was born in Finneytown and stayed there till I graduated from high school. Went to college at the University of Cincinnati and then spent 3 years in what used to be called the VISTA program, which is kind of the equivalent of the Domestic Peace Corps. I was out in the state of Washington for 3 years and then came back to Cincinnati, as most people do who are from here, and went to University of Cincinnati graduate program and in education, and here I am, many years later. Yeah, I identify as male, so my pronoun is he. I have no problem with any, people choosing whatever pronoun they want, but, since I identify as male, I just go with he, him. I identify myself as queer. When I first came out, I identified myself as gay because that was the prevailing major term at the time, but I like queer because queer to me indicates more activism, a little bit more radicalism. By nature, I'm a radical. I don't throw bricks and burn down buildings and stuff, but I do think a radical agenda is necessary to achieve LGBTQ plus rights for everybody. So, yeah, I would identify as male and a queer male. Publicly was probably in about 1979, which I was 30 years old at the time, so I came out late. I've known all my life, basically, that I was queer. But the whole reality of coming out in the 60s when I was growing up was just not reality. It was not a tenable situation. I practiced homosexuality and knew I was gay. But again, I call it my political coming out was not until about 1979. Wonderfully. I was scared to death to tell them because my parents, to begin with, were a lot older than other people my age. So I had this vision of me telling them I was queer and going to their house, and sitting down and talking to them, both clutch at their heart and drop dead of a heart attack. And I'd not only be responsible for being queer, but for killing my parents, But they didn't. My mom's first reaction was, "So what else is new?" It's like, "You've known all along." She says, I suspected as much, yes. My dad's reaction was funny. We sat at the kitchen table and when I was talking to him, and my dad's reaction was he was sitting there and just kept kind of had his hand on his chin thinking. It's like, okay. He says, "Well, I guess if you love somebody, it doesn't really matter what sex they are." Wow, from my parents, and like I said, being of a much older generation than most other people's parents my age, I thought that was really remarkable. The next person I told was my sister Linda, who was immediately older than me, a year and a half older than me, and we grew up together, so we were very close. And I made sure her husband was gone and her kids were in bed, and I went up to her house and I said, "Linda, I've got something to tell you." And she's like, "Okay, what is it?" And I told her I was gay. I used that term at the time. And she goes, "Oh, thank God." And I said, "What?" And she goes, "I thought you were going to tell me you had a drug problem or something like that." So my oldest sister Mary was dead at the time. She had died of breast cancer. But my second oldest sister, Barb, she was very accepting of it and very loving and was no problem meeting my friends or anybody I might be dating. But she always thought that the right woman would come along someday and turn me around. But she never really voiced that to me as much as she did to other people in the family. So and all my nephews and nieces, all my great nephews and nieces, everybody's very accepting. Now, I don't know if any of them have private thoughts that they're not sharing with me, but they certainly don't treat me any differently than anybody else. So I would say I've been very fortunate with my family, very fortunate. Not to my knowledge did I hear anything about being gay when I was growing up. I must have heard things because I internalized this whole feeling of like, oh, I'm ashamed of myself, I'm a sinner, I'm a bad person, I'm all the negative adjectives you could attach to it. But I don't recall hearing any of that from my family members. I think most of it got what kids at school, making queer jokes or something, or at the church I went to. I'm sure there were things talked about at the church. But again, I don't specifically remember anything. I just remember I had internalized these very, very negative feelings. I remember, I must have been only about maybe 8 or 9 years old, and we went to the Upper Peninsula, Michigan one year for a vacation, my family. And we'd stopped at Lake Huron on the way up for like a picnic lunch and a dip in Lake Huron. And I remember at that age looking at all the men on the beach thinking, oh man, they're really, I didn't use the word hot or cute, I just knew they were, somehow I was attracted to them. And I wasn't looking at the women, I was only looking at the men with their shirts off. So I knew at a very early age that something was different about me. In fact, even earlier than that, I got hooked on the show, the original TV show Superman, which was in black and white at the time, and only ran, I think it was from 1953 to about 58, so it was only about 4 or 5 years. So I was very young when I was watching that, because I was born in 1949, so I could only have been like 5, 6, 7 years old, and I knew I was attracted to Superman. And since then, people have asked me, well, was it just because he was a superhero and you're a boy with a hero, identity? And it's like, no, I was looking at his body and his little briefs that he wore. Well, they weren't briefs. Now I look at him, it's like, oh my God, you're kidding me. But I was very attracted to him. And so I knew from a very early age, but again, I don't recall where I heard negative things. I mean, as I got older, kids in school told queer jokes. Yes, I knew that. But I don't remember hearing it so early that I was prejudiced against it at that point, that early in my life. Early on, very negative. Cincinnati is never... I'm sorry?
Can you say that as a...
Yeah, okay, yeah. My first understanding of how people in Cincinnati, the general population, reacted to gays, lesbians, etc., was very negative. Cincinnati historically has been a very conservative city. Changing a little bit because the inner city now, most of the people in Cincinnati themselves tend to be Democrats, which tend to be a little bit more liberal. But at that time, it was everything. Hamilton County, Cincinnati was controlled by Republicans, and it was a different kind of conservative. It wasn't the right-wing knee-jerk reaction it is today. It was more of a moderate conservatism. But still, I didn't feel anything positive about gay people and the reaction or talk about gay people in the city at all. No, it was very negative. Let's see, I came to UC for undergraduate school when I was 17, because I started school early, so I graduated when I was 17, and my birthday's in October, so I started UC at 17, and was there for 4.5 years, so I got my undergraduate degree. Then left, I joined the program, the VISTA program, Volunteers in Service to America, and was assigned to what they called Region 10, which was the whole Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, and I think parts of Northern California, but I was assigned to a small town in Washington called South Bend to help start a youth center and get, the kids were involved in a lot of drugs and alcohol, and they wanted to have a better direction for the kids. So I was there for about 2.5 years. And then came back to Cincinnati. I think there's evidently a magnet implanted in people born in Cincinnati because they all come back eventually. I moved back in, would have been 1975, I believe it was. I moved back to Cincinnati from Washington State. Mostly with kids I'd graduated from college who were local, but then I met, I guess, quote unquote, the first love of my life, which turned out to be a disaster, but and he and I got an apartment together in Forest Park, Ohio, a little north of Cincinnati. And we lived together, I guess, for about 5 years. But it was when I met him, I thought he was just like some kind of socially awkward and whatnot. Turned out he was mentally disturbed. He became very abusive with me and shoved me down the steps at our townhouse one time, and went to visit his parents in Michigan and never came back. Well, he did. He and his parents came back like about 2 weeks later to pick up all the furniture that he owned in the house and just split, and that was it. Which really was the best thing that ever happened to me, because that allowed me then to get out of that cocoon I was in, hanging around with him all the time and a couple of other friends, and never going out to gay places, gay bars, or gay activities or anything. Just kind of living, and he was gay also, but he would not acknowledge it at all, not even to me. And even though we had a gay relationship, I don't know what he was thinking, but he turned out to be, like I said, very emotionally, mentally disturbed, and now he's dead. He killed himself a number of years ago. But getting away from him was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because it allowed me to then finally come out, as I call it, politically, acknowledge my queerness, and as I say, the rest is history. I joined the Stonewall Human Rights Organization Board of Directors and just became involved in all kinds of activism from that point on. Let's see, Jack left in 1980 or 81, so I probably joined, well, I didn't join Stonewall until about 1985. There was several periods of a lull there. I was kind of regaining myself from having the bizarre relationship with Jack and meeting new friends and starting to feel my way into the gay community. But I didn't really throw myself into it until I got on the board of directors of Stonewall in 1985. Well, I was physically, after I joined the board of Stonewall, I was living in Cincinnati and got involved a lot in their activity, well, not activities, but the movement, the gay movement. I went to my first Pride celebration in 1985. And then I just got involved more and more with Stonewall, eventually to the point where I think it was in 1988, I was appointed to what they call the Task Force on Discrimination, which was brand new. We'd never had one before, so I was kind of in charge of getting it started. And one person called me one night. We put my phone number out so people could call if they had a discrimination problem or issue. And one young man called me one night and was working in an old restaurant, I don't think they're here anymore, called In Cahoots. There was one in Clifton. There was one out in Kenwood Shopping Center. There was one in Indianapolis, and one in, it was either Louisville or Lexington. And then they also owned a restaurant downtown called The Diner, very avant-garde type, restaurant. And he called and said that he had been fired because he was gay. So we made an appointment to meet. I interviewed him, and it turned out his story was very, very convincing. So he gave me the names of several other people who he said also were fired because they were gay, men and women. And this just mushroomed, and finally I had interviews with about 12 people, I believe it was. The numbers may be a little bit wrong now. That was a number of years ago. But I believe it was 12 people, and we had built it, because they were definitely fired because they were gay. So eventually what that led to was we met with the owner of the whole franchise, who refused to do anything about it. It's like, well, no, they weren't really fired for that reason. They were incompetent, blah, blah, blah. Well, we called a boycott. And we got support from virtually every civil rights organization, human rights organization, churches. I think we had a list of about 43 organizations and or churches that supported our boycott against the In Cahoots chain. Their business in 1 month went down by 35%. And suddenly the owner was calling us on the phone, and we went down and met with him, and we had we didn't call them demands, we called them, I forget what we called it, but we didn't want to sound really militant at the time, which certainly that changed in me, believe me, but at the time we called them requests or something like that they hire the people back if they wanted to be hired back, that they pay back pay, that they make a public statement in all the newspapers and on the television stations. There was no social internet at the time. About what had happened, and that they supported and had no discrimination against gays and lesbians anymore, and that they included a non-discrimination policy in their corporate operating procedures. And they accepted all of them. Now, in my memory, I think there were a handful of people who went back and wanted their jobs, but most of them had gone on doing other jobs at that point, because this went on for from the time they were first fired to the time everything was settled was probably a year. We announced it at Pride in 1988, at the Pride celebration that we had won the victory. It was covered by all the national media at the time, the gay media. The Advocate was the big magazine at the time, because it was the first time, I'm very proud of this, it was the first time in the United States, or in the world actually, that a boycott had been called against an organization for queer issues and had won. Now, granted, it wasn't the biggest corporation in the company, it wasn't like our country, like IT&T or AT&T or anything, but they had restaurants in Louisville, Cincinnati, Columbus also, I believe, and then Indianapolis. So it was a major victory. They've gone out of business. I mean, not because of that, but yeah, right. I think the Diner stayed open for quite a while. The In Cahoots restaurants drifted away and went out of business, and then I think the Diner was the last one to be open, and it closed. I'm not sure how long ago now. It was a really cool restaurant. They all were very good. They had good food. They just had a very bad policy. I think you're absolutely right. The activism now is all over the place, and there doesn't sit well in a lot of cities. Of course, I can't speak for other cities, but in Cincinnati, there's no central organization that literally directs, leads, encourages anything. It's just like you said. It's very disparate. I wish that would change. It's going to have to change because we're heading, there's been 430 laws introduced in states across the country since January that have to do with gays, lesbians, transgender, drag queens now, obviously. It's all starting to go against us again. So we need to organize, we need to stand up again and get vocal and loud and march and rally and everything involved. Right, I would go to most of the places were bars. There were a bunch of organizations in the city, religious organizations for queers and social organizations and mostly political organizations. But most of the socializing was at bars. I went to the Pipeline occasionally. It's now closed, and Shooters occasionally, which is now closed. Simon Says, which I think is now closed. I'm not sure. Mainly the Dock, though, was the big dance bar in the city. So I went to the Dock. Mike Chanick and I would go down there on like a Friday night. And because we were both very active in the city, we could just sit there on these stools and everybody come up and talk to us and buy us drinks. So it's like, oh, this is great. But it was well worth it because I did a lot of canvassing and talking with people, which got me more and more involved in different organizations. So, yeah, the Pipeline, Shooters, occasionally Simon Says, because I thought there was a guy that was really cute bartender, so I went to just see him. Nothing ever came of it, but mostly the Dock. Oh, also Shirley's Bar up in Clifton. It was Shirley's Tight End. I think it started out I can't remember if it started out as Shirley's Tight End. Everybody just called it Shirley's, though. Mike and I met in 1985 also, a lot of things in 1985, and he was in charge of the alternating currents radio program on WAIF 88.3. And he I don't remember how he had heard about me, but I was writing my dissertation at the time for my doctorate at UC, and it was on gay and lesbian issues. It was the reaction of secondary school teachers to gays and lesbians in their classroom. And that's an interesting story because my committee was all in favor of it. They just thought that was a wonderful idea. Well, the University of Cincinnati said, no, you can't do that. And they actually said in their reasoning, we're not in the business to change people's minds. That's a university that's supposed to be educating people, and they're not in the business of changing people's minds. So my committee went to bat for me, but the university would not budge on it. So what we eventually did was we were going to go into the public schools, Cincinnati public schools, and they agreed to it also, but UC would not back it up. So we eventually just used students who were in training to be teachers in the College of Education. And UC was okay with that, and the students were okay with that, so we generated the data from, I guess, was about 10 or 12 different classes from different levels of their education, through the master's and doctoral program, to get all the ideas and the feelings of people, because this was in I graduated with my doctorate in 88, so this was in 85, 86, 87. It was not very progressive at the time, and there were still a lot of horror stories about how teachers were treating gay and lesbian students. So we did that, then we ran we did a questionnaire about attitudes ahead of time, then ran a 10-week training session about sensitivity issues with gays and lesbians, and then ran a post-program questionnaire. And the attitudes changed significantly. I honestly can't remember the statistics right now, but they changed significantly. And hopefully that started educating young people who are going out into the schools to become the new teachers of the future. And again, I'm proud of that because it was the very first gay and lesbian dissertation done anywhere in the United States that can be documented. Well, it was cool. One great thing about being the first one, they had nothing to compare it to. So when I went in for my dissertation defense, and they were supposed to ask you all the questions, I went in the room, and they were all sitting there, and they kind of looked at each other, and like, so, Mr. Maddux, what are your plans after you graduate? No questions on the dissertation at all, because I'd also been smart enough to submit the chapters as I went along, because each person on my committee represented a different area in academia and research that would contribute to the dissertation. And so each committee member saw each chapter as I went along, so when I finally put it together, there was really nothing to do about it except go, yeah, we accept it. They told me to go out in the hall and sit there for a few minutes, and a couple of minutes later, Chet Lane, the supervisor, the director of the committee, came out and he says, well, welcome, Dr. Maddux, come back in, So it was great, yeah. Aww. It was wonderful. Well, I mean, the groups I was a part of was Stonewall. Stonewall had two organizations, the Human Rights Organization, which, let's see, they could support candidates and issues and stuff like that. And then there was the Stonewall Political Organization. I was on the board for both of them, but we had to separate our business. Then I got involved in the gay and lesbian, which one? I got to think I have all the names correct now. Well, I was elected president of the at the time was called the Greater Cincinnati Gay and Lesbian Coalition. We later added bisexual, then transgender, and et cetera now. But I was elected president of that, which I was forced then to resign from the board of directors of Stonewall because it would be a clash of interests. So I was president of the coalition for 3 years, which also, and that's what we'll talk about later, I'm sure, involved being in charge of organizing Pride Week. The coalition at the time was in charge of Pride. I was also involved in the University of Cincinnati Gay and Lesbian Teachers Union. I was the secretary of that organization, very, very small. There were only like 5 or 6 members, but at least was active. With another friend named Dan Stephen, who's now moved, he's in Colorado, I believe, teaching history. We formed the Gay and Lesbian Alliance of Ohio. We wanted to connect all the cities with what was going on and resources and any information about marches, whatever. And we got representation. We met in Yellow Springs, Ohio for our first meeting. And we got representation from Cleveland, Columbus, Toledo, a number of small towns, Newark and Cincinnati, Chillicothe. And we actually formed an organization, but unfortunately nobody wanted to do anything. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for doing a newsletter or doing this or contacting, senators and representatives in the state of Ohio. So it folded after about a year because Dan and I were doing all the work and we just couldn't manage that with our other responsibilities and our private lives. So I was involved with GALA, and then the Greater Cincinnati Gay and Lesbian, no, it wasn't called that. It was
They love their names.
What is it?
They love their names.
GLAMA, Gay and Lesbian March Activists of Cincinnati. That was founded by Todd Cam, Carol Lippman, Shane Q. He, and Bob McNee. And I joined with that. I liked that because it was more of a radical group. Now again, we weren't out throwing bricks through windows and burning down buildings, but it was more than just like, well, yeah, we'll take what they throw us. It's like, no, we got to take it to people. We got to take it to the powers that be. So we can't say, if we wait for our freedom, our equality, we'll all be dead by that time. So I was a member of that. I also was a member, I got on board with Wave Radio after Mike had interviewed me. You asked, I don't think I ever finished that story. You asked me how Michael Chanick and I met. He'd heard about my dissertation, my work at UC, so he called me in for an interview. And he was funny because he conferred my doctorate upon me long before the university did. But so we got to be friends, and then he invited me to come down, and I became an opinion, not columnist, but talking head on Wave Radio. And each week I would deliver another of my writings, my essays, which eventually were published into a book called Gay and Lesbian, I can't remember the name of it now. It's Pink Triangles and Rainbow Dreams, collection of the essays. I've rewritten them for publication, but so I was involved in Wave Radio. I started writing for a magazine called The Gay Nouveau, again, doing columns, opinion columns. Then got involved in Outfront Radio, Outfront Gay and Lesbian TV, and became the producer and director of that for 3 years, I believe it was. And then I'd gotten kind of burned out. I mean, I was doing so much, and it got to the point where if there was a family gathering, a party, or somebody's birthday, I'd have to make appointments weeks ahead of time to go see my own family. So I kind of pulled back in the early 1990s from all my activism. I mean, I've stayed active as far as writing a lot. I still write all the time. I'm working on a new book now. Also, when I was at Stonewall, I had formed and was in charge of their Speakers Bureau. So I guess throughout my 10 years as an activist, I have spoken to probably several hundred groups of people. University, college students, students who, teachers invited me in to speak to their classes about gay issues, health departments in Louisville and Lexington, Cincinnati, police academy here in Cincinnati, and organizations like that were interested in some sensitivity training and just being able to talk to a real queer and find out what we were thinking, how we were thinking, why we were thinking what we did, and try to break down those barriers that existed for no real reason. So yeah, I was very involved in the Speakers Bureau, wrote the Speaker's Manual. But then, like I said, in the early 1990s, early to mid-90s, I started getting burned out and needed some time to myself, so I pulled back other than my writing, and I continue my writing. I think I would like to get involved more now because, again, as I was mentioning earlier, we really need a whole new spate of activism to take place in this country and this city. I've warned for a long, long time that when you're a third or fourth class citizen of a nation, of this nation, your rights can be taken back away from you at any time and you have no recourse for the most part. So we need to get organized again. We need to get political. We need to turn our rallies back into political rallies as well as celebrations. So my only problem with getting active now is that I'm 73. I'm still vital and active, I think. But I really think that younger people need to be the voice, not us old people. You know, we can give advice, we can give suggestions, we can serve on committees and stuff, but I think the face of the community needs to be young women, young men, queers, lesbians, transsexuals, drag queens, anybody who has a stake in this whole movement. Well, I think part of that is because when I did withdraw from activism, and I remember this when I first started becoming active, I was thinking, well, what happened to these people I used to hear about? You get so burned out because there's so much to do and there's so few people who are willing to do it. Then when I pulled back, you're forgotten. The name is forgotten a little bit. It might be brought up again by Mike Chanick, likes to bring everybody up and get them back into the spotlight, which I appreciate from him. But I think that, a lot of people don't necessarily know who I am anymore, so that's okay. I never did any of this for personal attention or gratification or money or anything like that. But it's not said that I'm necessarily forgotten. It's said that our history has to be reinvented every 10, 15, 20 years. That we need more of a historical archive, which Ohio Lesbian Archives is doing. So we need more of that so that young people have a place to go to find out about, not their history individually, but the history of the people like them who came before them. Back then, no. In fact, when I became president of the coalition, and thus in charge of Pride Week, there was this big brouhaha about, well, should lesbians and gay men march together? It's like, yeah, why not? I can't think of any reason why not. And what about drag queens? Oh, that's going to give a really bad image if the TV stations come down and put this on the news on Saturday night. No, drag queens too. Everybody who has a stake in this is welcome. How can we dare as gay men say, we want our equal rights, but then not give it to women, not give it to drag queens, not to give it to transsexuals wasn't a big issue at that time. It was talked about, but it wasn't quite the issue it is now. Bisexuality was a much bigger issue at the time. So I was very, very strongly in favor of including everybody in the parades, everybody in the celebrations. I went to bat, and I had a lot of men, gay men, who just wouldn't talk to me for a while because I wanted ladies, I wanted queer, I wanted dykes in the parade. It's like, yeah, I was made an honorary lesbian, back in the 1980s, the late 1980s, because of my fighting for women. I probably knew more lesbians than I did gay men, So, and we got along famously, and I never could understand why, like I said a moment ago, if you want your rights, how dare you deny them to somebody else? So, yeah, I don't think there was a lot of interaction between different groups of people. If you belong to this church group, then you went to those meetings. If you belong to this political organization, you went to their meetings. And even the political organizations had to struggle with each other to get on the same page, because some were a little bit more radical. Stonewall took a more moderate approach to things. They liked working with politicians, supporting politicians who favored our issues and were willing to vote for our issues. Were groups like GLAMA, ACT UP. Those groups were more radical and more willing to take it to the powers that be right in your face. So I bridged the gap between both of those groups and was successful to a certain extent. I think because people considered me friendly and approachable. I wasn't standoffish. I wasn't like, well, I'm better than you because I'm president of the coalition and I'm really important, blah, blah, blah. I could care less about all that stuff. So I was able to, hang out with people who are more radical and people who are more moderate. But then by doing so, people on both sides would get discouraged with me and distraught. It's like, well, John, you're being too radical. No, John, you're not being radical enough. So you can't win for losing sometimes. But no, to go back to your original question, people didn't really interact. The different groups of people, women, men, gays, lesbians, radicals, moderates, liberals, whatever. Everybody was in their own little group. Now, by being like that, we probably had, I think at one time, the height of my presidency in the coalition, we had 43 different groups that were members of the coalition. So I don't think you could even find 13 groups nowadays in greater Cincinnati. So there were a lot of groups for a lot of people with a lot of different causes and issues, and the coalition attempted to bring them all together to get on the same page. And we did. Up until that time, we had the 3 most successful Pride celebrations in June ever in Cincinnati. And we increased it each year, too. Now, the current group that's doing Pride in Cincinnati has certainly expanded way beyond what we could have even imagined. Now we've got, what? Thousands of people going to the celebration on Pride Saturday and the different activities they sponsor. Back then we had a whole slate of activities, and they were well supported. But again, they were supported by people from that group that were doing that particular activity for the week, for the event. But I think we grew from the first year I didn't do it. I should say that the coalition was in charge of the Pride celebration, and because I was president, that made me kind of the de facto head of Pride. But I made sure that I appointed 2 people each of the 3 years that I was president of the coalition, a man and a woman, young. I also wanted young people. I introduced a lot of young people to the celebrations because, again, why a bunch of us old people should we be doing it? We should get young people enthused and excited. So we went from the first year, which was in 1989, was my first year as president. And I think we met on Fountain Square, as we used to, mostly a political rally. And I guess maybe 500 people attended, which for back then was great, and was covered by Channel 9 and all the 3 major networks. I don't think Fox had a major network at that time, Channel 19. But 9, 12, and 5 were all there and had varying amounts of coverage on the evening news, but at least it was getting its publicity. And then the next year, we were still at Fountain Square, but we'd increased to about 1,000 people, so doubled it. The third year, we decided to really do something, quote-unquote, radical, and we moved it. We had the jump-off place for the parade being Fountain Square. And we had that be the rally, the political rally, and then the parade formed and marched from there down to Sawyer's Point on the river. And that was the first year we had moved from downtown to have a parade and a celebration elsewhere. It was still technically downtown, but not right at Fountain Square. And when we got down there, we had a lineup of all the local entertainers. Chris Collier was there, Scirocco. I'm not even going to start naming people because I now forget somebody. But I guess and that was a celebration. That was singing and dancing, and I don't even think we had any political speeches down there. That was all at the kickoff rally at Fountain Square. And we increased to probably, we never could get an official count because it was on the river there at the park, and there were lots of people there other than just who had come for Pride celebration. But we estimated that there were at least 2,000 people who had come because of Pride. So that's an increase in 3 years from 500 to over 2,000.
And you said that was 89,
90 and 91, right. And interestingly, I would stand behind up on the walkway where people walked, and we were in one of the amphitheaters, and people would be walking along going like, what's this going on down here? And they'd stop like, well, this is really cool, this is entertaining. Oh, and people would say, oh, it's the geek queers or something like that. But they were entertained and they liked it. And so we were interacting then with straight people. And one of the funniest things that happened probably in all of Pride's history in Cincinnati was Scirocco, a very beloved drag queen, who was going through the transition process to become a woman. And she was a great drag queen, very friendly, very affable. Well, she was performing and her dress broke, like Janet Jackson at the Super Bowl that year, and her breast popped out. Well, the gasps, because there were a lot of straight people there, was like, oh my God, but she just covered herself up and went on singing, and people were cheering and applauding for it. It was great. It was really great. And she had no embarrassed. I'm sure she was probably embarrassed, but she didn't let on that she was embarrassed. She covered that really well. So that was the scene of our greatest successes in Pride up until then, and one of the most embarrassing moments in my life as president of the coalition. Because at the time, one of my responsibilities with Pride was also to go to the mayor of the city and get a proclamation, a gay, lesbian proclamation for the day, for Pride Day. Well, the other mayors had done it, Jerry Springer did it. Bobby Stern was the first one to do it. Jerry Springer, then Charlie Lucan. Well, David Mann was the mayor at the time. And so Betsy Gressler, who was president of Stonewall, and I went down to meet with him in his office, and, well, he couldn't do it. But he said, well, I'll give you a tolerance proclamation, which we both were really skeptical about. We talked about it, and in retrospect, we should not have accepted it, but we did, because we thought, well, a little bit's better than nothing, but that was wrong thinking. So Saturday morning of the celebration, we had the kickoff at Fountain Square, and we marched down there, and that's right, we did have one political aspect there, because I was getting up to read the tolerance proclamation. Oh my God, it was met with a thunderous round of booing. And I wasn't prepared for that. And I'm like, yeah, boo! I started booing and throwing my fist in the air. I covered it up really well, but I was so embarrassed that I was reading that to all my queer friends and queers I didn't know, and asking people to accept tolerance when that was not at all acceptable. And I did cover it up well, but Betsy and I talked later, and we agreed we should not have accepted the tolerance proclamation. But we did, and so I guess, as they say, that's history now. And the tolerance, as I said, was roundly booed, which I joined in quickly, So, and Betsy wasn't on stage, so I was the only one that got the brouhaha for it, but that's okay. Yeah, I can't remember the year that Bobby Stern issued the first positive proclamation. I can't think what year that was. It must have been like, I was going to say 78 or 79. Right. She's like an icon in the community. Well, at least she used to be. I don't know about it, young people even know about her, because again, we don't have any way of transmitting our history. Verbally, certainly, but, as I said earlier, I think Mike Chanik and I are the old senior citizen activists now. Everybody else has moved away or is dead. My first Pride, I was not involved, I just went to it. And that was in 1985, after the political coming out. And I'd heard about him, but I didn't dare go to him. I was so scared about being identified, you know. So 1985 was the first one I went to, and I really wasn't involved. Now, in 1986, I got more involved by like being on a cleanup committee or something like that. I still wasn't really involved politically yet. I got more and more involved, obviously, then as I got involved with the Task Force on Discrimination with Stonewall, and then eventually the Greater Cincinnati Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Coalition. Right. Yeah, let's see, the 3 years there with the coalition, and then when it restarted in 2000, I believe it was, in Northside, I was involved in the committee meetings in 2000 and 2001. My years may be getting screwed up now. And then I was involved in the Pride celebration itself at Burnett Woods, as far as being Todd Cam and I one year were in charge of the political aspect of it, getting people to speak and whatnot. So I guess altogether, Pride celebrations, probably 3, 6, 8 or 9 of them. Yeah. With varying degrees of involvement. I haven't in the last couple years simply because of the heat. I just can't stand or sit and watch the parade that much anymore. And there's an element of it that I don't want to denigrate anybody who's on the committee because they do a good job and hard work. But the parades seem to be more just a parade of cars from this church, that business, that other business. And it's great to have supporters, no doubt. It's great to have supporters from the political or from the economic community, from banks and businesses and whatnot, and churches and everything. But all the businesses, bless them for doing it, but they also know we have money that's going to spend. And they want to get that money too. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only reason they support or participate in Pride. But we need to get back to a bunch of queers marching and chanting and yelling and screaming and all that kind of stuff. And so the parades are kind of just another parade for me. Right.
Community's never.
So yeah, I mean, I would be more I'm more in the middle, leaning to the radical side, because I really do think, as I've said a number of times now, we need much more visibility, much more many more voices, loud voices, angry voices, many people standing up. And again, I welcome gay supporters, gay businesses that support gays, all that stuff. I don't denigrate that at all or accuse them of being hypocrites or anything. But we need gay people, people who are really being discriminated against. A lot of it was because of was it issue 3 or issue 5? I forget, issue 3. And when Cincinnati had that convoluted, poorly worded issue on the ballot, should gays and lesbians be equal rights and blah, blah, blah. And it was voted down. No, they should not. And at that point, I think most people gave up. Most people said, well, if that's the way you think, fine. I'll be as queer as I can be, but I'll just be it on my own time. Go to the bars and whatnot. And Stonewall started disappearing into the distance. The coalition broke up. A lot of the other organizations, church organizations and social organizations, broke up because people were frustrated. They'd worked so long and so hard only to be slapped in the face with voters saying, no, you don't get any rights. You don't get your equal rights. That would have been 93, I believe, 93. And I think from about 93 through, it was repealed then, I forget the year it was repealed. But from 93 up through the end of that decade, it was pretty dead in Cincinnati, queer-wise. And it wasn't until Chris Good, just an everyday member of the community, decided he wanted to get Pride going again. So he announced there'd be some meetings, and he just didn't take it over like, I'm in charge now, but he got everybody involved and got it going up again in Burnett Woods and then marching up to Northside. And so the 2000s is when it saw the rebirth. But yeah, that period between about 93 and 99, dead.
Nothing was happening?
Virtually nothing. I think there was a Pride celebration maybe in 95. Again, I don't know the year for sure. It was out at Lunken Airfield, and they had a big picnic, gay, lesbian picnic. But But that was about it. Yeah, I think, again, I do remember a parade in probably 92, because it was the year after I was not president. And that was the last parade I remember until 2000. Mostly as an advisor, went to the meetings and, people would say, well, what did you guys do back then, and how did you get involved, how did you get it started, and things like that. So mostly as an advisor. It wasn't until, I guess, about 2002 maybe that I got involved in the political aspect of it and trying to round up people to speak at the rally politically.
Do you remember the impact of HIV/AIDS?
It was devastating. Oh yeah, it was devastating. Yeah, it was like COVID-19. But only for the gay community. People were scared to death. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know what the incidence of sexual activity, how much that dropped, but people were scared to death. And people had friends dying right and left. At that point, there were no real treatments or anything for AIDS. And it was just AIDS then. It wasn't HIV. It was just AIDS. A lot of political movement against it because the administration then, the Ronald Reagan administration, wouldn't even talk about it. And state politicians wouldn't even talk about it. So it was very, very frightening, very harrowing. I remember people, if they knew someone had AIDS, even gay people who should otherwise be better educated, wouldn't go near them, were afraid to touch them. People were scared to touch each other.